Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
They're not excited about this. Our speakers today are V.G. Govindarajan and Chris Trimble, who are both professors at the Tuck School of Management or Business at Dartmouth. They're both fantastic writers, and when I read about the book that they've published, I was very excited to invite them out to Microsoft because I think they talk about some of the exact issues that I hear us discussing over and over and over again on IM together, on blogs together, when we sit around in meetings together. Okay, so we're this great company, and it's really, really successful, and that's really wonderful. And we have a lot of new ideas of what to do next. So what should we do next? And how do we make sure we do the right thing next? And how do we do the next thing correctly? And these guys are experts in that. They both have written extensively academically and for the general public in this area, and I'm just so pleased that they could both be with us this afternoon. Please help me welcome V.G. and Chris.
Well, thank you, Tamara, for that very kind introduction. It's great to be here at Microsoft. I'm just going to extend the introduction a little bit before I turn it over to my colleague and co-author and mentor and friend, VG. I'd like to fill you in on just a bit of our personal stories before we get into the real meat of the material, just 3 or 4 minutes worth. You know, VG's story begins when he was 20 years old, and he had graduated, of course, with top honors and from one of the most prestigious universities in India. And he decided to apply for a management rotation program at one of the most prestigious firms in India. This was a firm in the textiles industry, an industry, by the way, which has a centuries-old tradition. It's a little bit older than Microsoft. So anyway, VG was one of only 12 people out of thousands of applicants selected for this job. And so a mere 2 years later, he had experience in marketing and finance and manufacturing, operations. And he excelled, and his fast-track career was all set. All he had to do was sort of follow the path in front of him. Then he filled his first full-time post, okay? And everything began to change. Now, this is me in my first job. I was a submarine officer in the United States Navy aboard the USS Minneapolis St. Paul. By the way, the USS Minneapolis St. Paul is the only ship in the entire Navy that has a logo showing the ship going down. Excuse me, that didn't bother me. Like Sean Connery in The Hunt for Red October, I was a nerves of steel, steely-eyed warrior of the deep. At least that's what I told people in bars. So my first task when I came on board was to master quite literally an encyclopedia of submarine science and technology and rules and procedures. And when I had done that, I was awarded these gold dolphins. This signifies a sort of coming of age in the Navy. And on that day that I was recognized as, quote, fully qualified in submarines, my life began to change. See, VG and I both went through a very similar transition. From those points on, the fraction of our time that we're able to spend studying and learning and doing new things began to decline. And the fraction of time that we spent managing people and big groups of people and these intricate, complicated business processes started to rise. And that was hard. It was hard because organizations, as you know, are complex. It was also hard because we both started to nurture a number of creative ideas. We had all sorts of ideas about better ways to manage, better ways to help people reach their full potential. Probably you have some ideas too. But it seemed impossible to push these ideas forward. VG and I both learned quickly and painfully that big organizations can be like machines. They're hardwired to excel at the one game they're really good at. Okay? And it's very hard to rewire them. So with sort of more and more angst with each passing week, VG dreamed of changing business in India, and I dreamed of changing the United States Navy. We each had a moment of clarity. One day, VG noticed that professors and consultants sporting graduate degrees but no gray hair were bringing about some pretty big changes because they had direct access to the top. Okay? And I just happened to stumble into this book, In Search of Excellence. This is one of the first and best blockbuster books on management. At least it was the first one I read. And reading this book was like a revelation because these authors seemed to connect with all the frustrations that I was feeling, and they seemed to validate a few of my ideas. So in different times and in different places, both of us decided to leave our first job. We're too curious to learn more about how organizations really work and what it takes for them to reach peak performance. In the 1970s, VG immigrated to the United States and enrolled at the Harvard Business School. And a couple decades later, I chose to attend the Tuck School at Dartmouth, where today we are both professors. And we've learned a lot about what it takes for organizations to innovate and what it takes for them to excel. For example, we've learned that there's all different kinds of innovation. Okay? Some innovations improve existing processes. Okay? Some offer enhancements to existing products and services. Okay? But we've seen that the most difficult kind of innovation of all are innovations that demand that you create, launch, and grow an entirely new business. Okay? What makes it so hard? That's what we've been focused on since 2000. Okay? And we've had a great deal of fun because the people that we've spoken with have great stories to tell. These are people that walked away from the comfortable routine of organizational life because they wanted the opportunity to create something new. Okay? They shared with us exhilarating highs and excruciating lows. But most of all, they enlightened us on the unique triumphs and tragedies of entrepreneurship within established organizations. So this year, we published a book, 10 Rules for Strategic Innovators, From Idea to Execution. And we're very proud of this work. But we both know it takes a lot more than research and writing to create real change in real organizations. That's why both of us spend a lot more time working shoulder to shoulder with ambitious innovators and less time now researching and writing. Let me cover our agenda briefly. First, we'll talk about why strategic balance is so important and what happens when your strategy places too little emphasis on the future. Okay? Then we'll share a few innovation stories, and we'll wrap up with some key principles derived from our research about how to manage breakthrough new businesses. Okay? Fiji?
Good afternoon.
Hello.
1:45 in the afternoon on a Thursday. This is a deadly time slot for making presentations. In fact, what happens this time of the day when you start giving presentations, after about 15 minutes of presentation, you tend to lose 50% of the audience. They're gone. Not physically, but mentally, they kind of wandered away. In fact, what research shows, this time of the day when you start giving presentations, after about 20 minutes of presentation, you tend to lose 75% of the audience. After 30 minutes of presentation, you tend to lose 100% of the audience. So by 2:15, all of you will be gone. In fact, what research shows, this time of the day when your mind begins to wander away, what it wanders to is your wildest fantasies. So at least at a minimum, it'll be an exciting afternoon. That's all I can. I want you to take a minute and reflect. Inside Microsoft, think about everything you have done in the last 12 months and try to put them in 3 boxes. Box 1, I say, is manage the present. Box 2 is selectively forget the past. And box 3 is create the future. Manage the present, box 1. Selectively abandon the past, box 2. And create the future, box 3. What I find working with organizations is organizations overspend their time in box 1. and think they are doing strategy. Is box one important? Absolutely. Is box one critical? Absolutely. Is box one strategy? No. Strategy is really about box three. How do we create our future in 2020? And simultaneously, how do we selectively give up the past? Another word for box one is competition for the present. Another word for box two, box three is competition for the future. I say strategy has a lot to do with competition for the future. It's got less to do with competition for the present. There is a fundamental difference between competition for the present and competition for the future. And that fundamental difference is competition for the present is in response to linear changes in your industry. Because the changes are linear, because the changes are incremental, the organizational response is going to be incremental changes. Another word for that is continuous process improvement. Competition for the future is in response to discontinuous changes, non-linear changes, fundamental shifts. Because the changes are discontinuous, the organizational response has to be non-linear as well. If you want to look in the next 25 years, what could be one discontinuous shift? How about the emerging markets? Just take India and China. Today, India, the GDP is about $700 billion. China is twice as big. The GDP is about $1.3 trillion. So between India and China, we have $2 trillion of GDP. The worldwide GDP today is $40 trillion. So India and China represent about 5% of the world GDP today. Of course, they represent 30% of the worldwide population. That's why they are poor today. Incidentally, the picture is just the reverse in the US. The US GDP today is $12 trillion. So US represents 30% of worldwide GDP today, but only accounts for 5% of the worldwide population. That's why we are so rich. But now what's going to happen in the next 25 years is the interesting question. China has grown about 10% every year in the last 5 years. India has grown anywhere from 6 to 8% in the last 5 years. Every study that I look at, whether it is World Bank or Goldman Sachs, indicates in the next 25 years, India and China will grow more aggressively than in the last 5 years as they clean out the roads and straighten out the political process, etc. Suppose you take a $2 trillion base and apply a compounded growth rate of 10% every year. What happens is the magic of compounding is such that by year 2030, the next 25 years, India and China will be, by 2030, $40 trillion in GDP. The size of the worldwide GDP today. $38 trillion of GDP is going to be created in these two economies. If I am Microsoft, strategy for me is to think about what share of that opportunity space should belong to me. And if you want to think about that opportunity space, you cannot take business models that work for you in the US and take it there. That requires fundamentally box 2, box 3 thinking. About 10 years ago, Ford Motor Corporation went into India. And they knew when they went into India, Indian consumer cannot afford a very expensive automobile. So they decided to take an automobile from this country, which was priced for $20,000, and said, let's take this automobile into India. But before we send it out there, let's take out unnecessary costs from this automobile. So they put together a design team in Detroit to figure out what costs in that automobile can be eliminated. And the design team decided, instead of having power windows on all the 4 doors, let's just have power windows on the front 2 doors. Does it save costs? Absolutely. But what happens is, in India, people who buy a $20,000 automobile are typically very, very rich. So they have chauffeurs. So the chauffeur got the power window. I'm not making this up. This looked like a perfectly logical thing to do when you're looking at the Indian market sitting from Detroit. Incidentally, this is not the bad part of the story. The bad part of the story is, at best, they could reach 1% of the Indian population. Incidentally, markets like India and China are big because there are a lot of people. You're going to cater to the 1% of the Indian population. Those markets are not big at all. If I'm Microsoft, I need to be thinking about, how do I capture the remaining 99%? Capturing share in the remaining 99% fundamentally requires box 2, box 3 thinking. You can never take a $20,000 automobile and try to price it for $2,000 by taking $18,000 of cost out. It's not going to do it. For two reasons. One, you can never bring it down to $2,000. But even if you try to bring it down, you're going to dumb down the automobile. Indians don't want lousy products. They want world-class products. If I'm Microsoft, I need to be thinking about, how do I reach out to the illiterate people in India? They're not going to buy your Excel and Word and products like that. They just can't speak and write. That's the challenge we need to be thinking about. Have you heard of a company called Encyclopedia Britannica? Yeah. You put them out of business, incidentally. In fact, in 1990, Encyclopedia Britannica had a virtual lock on its industry with 3 core competencies. Content expertise, core competence number 1. They had done research on so many topics. They had a virtual lock on knowledge. Core competence number 2, packaging capability. They can take that phenomenal content and produce the 400 volume, beautiful looking book set. Core competence number 3, marketing and distribution capability. They can take that 400 volume book set and reach the consumer better than anyone in the world through their 10,000 strong door-to-door salesmen. Now, what happened in 1990? This company called Microsoft comes into the encyclopedia space with a product called Encarta, encyclopedia on a CD-ROM. Of course, Encyclopedia Britannica will not license out their content to Microsoft. So Microsoft went to a second-tier player in the encyclopedia industry called Funk & Wagnalls. In fact, Funk & Wagnalls' product was so bad, it used to be sold in supermarkets for deep discount. If you bought enough grocery, probably you'll get the encyclopedia free. Microsoft gets a so-called inferior product, jazzes it up with some graphics, puts it in a CD-ROM, and sells it for $50. At a time when Encyclopedia Britannica was selling its 400-volume book set for close to $3,000. Now, what was the response of Encyclopedia Britannica to this nonlinear shift? What Encyclopedia Britannica did in the early 90s was they also took their phenomenal content and put it inside a CD-ROM and gave that CD-ROM free of cost to the customer, no charge, provided the customer will buy the $3,000 book set. But if you didn't want the $3,000 book set, then the CD-ROM costed $1,500. Their assertion being, our quality is so good, you should be willing to pay the premium price. The rest is history, as they say. As you well know, Encyclopedia Britannica, this great brand, went bankrupt in the early 90s. Tell me something. How come Encyclopedia Britannica, how come they do a lousy job in box 2 and box 3? Incidentally, they could be the Google today. They certainly had the capability to be the Google today. How come they missed the boat? What do you think?
Their expertise.
Tell me what you mean by expertise.
This is a software company. We can build software. They're not a software company. You know, CDs are completely foreign to them.
Completely different media. It's about it.
Partly it may be the software capability they didn't have. It's a completely different media, yeah?
They overestimated how much customers are willing to pay for their quality content.
That's right. They overestimated the value of their content. Incidentally, their customer was, the historical customer was an affluent, middle-aged person who took a cup of coffee, went to the porch, sat down, and opened the Encyclopedia Britannica. The smell of the book meant a lot to them, right? Tell me, was there a fundamental shift in the customer space in the 80s? Who was coming in big numbers, yeah?
Well, maybe that age, but what you're just saying is the same thing that happened before, the 99 to the 1, and that is that what they missed was the shift coming in computing shifted to the 99. The 99 were going to be using the Uncarta type product, whereas the 1 was going to be using the older product. They didn't look quite the same.
Part of the shift in the, yeah?
I would say they failed to adapt.
Yeah. Why did they fail to adapt?
Because they were looking in the past. They were not seeing the competitor as Microsoft, and they were not looking at what are the new things that Microsoft can put in, for example, audio, video, all those things.
That's right. If you ask them who their competitor was in 1990, they would have said, oh, we have done the analysis on Funk and Wagnalls, and we can dominate them forever. And I want you to think about, is Microsoft today as where Encyclopedia Britannica was in 1990? Are we paying attention to some of the discontinuous shifts that are happening around us? But certainly, they had felt their competitors said to be too narrow. Anything else is a problem.
Well, they addressed the problem in a linear way.
They were addressing the problem, but in a limited way. They were addressing it in a box one way, right?
Linear way. They addressed it that way.
That's right. Yeah.
They were expecting the business model they had used over the years, which had proven to be very successful, to continue into the future.
That's right. In some sense, they took their success in 1990 to mean their business model of the past is validated. So therefore, their way of creating the future is to do more of it. I'm so successful, that means I must be doing something smart. Instead of saying success implies we have to change. That's interesting. Yeah?
It's ironic because we're about to be taken out of that market by media. And we're not responding to that.
Fascinating. We can relate to some of that, yeah?
Well, I just wanted to point out, sort of building on her point, that I think up and through about 1990, continuous and process improvement was the name of the game. And then over the last 15 years, what we've seen is that companies recognize that the entire ecosystem, the plates, the tectonic plates, are changing in a way that if they don't start to think about discontinuous innovation, then they actually are going to get left in the dust.
And I think extrapolating your point, in some sense, the last 25 years of Microsoft, we have had a great run. The question is, can we sustain that run in the next 25 years by just repeating what we have done in the last 25 years and reflecting on what you're saying, in some sense, the rate of change in the next 25 years. And the nonlinear nature of the change is going to be much more rapid than the last 25 years. Therefore, we need to be thinking about box 2, box 3. Again, think about their core competencies of Encyclopedia Britannica. Book production know-how, door-to-door selling model, all have become core liabilities. There is a box 2 problem for them. They're unwilling to give up some of the orthodoxies which are working for them. One of the metaphors that I and Chris like to talk about box 1, box 2, box 3 is a metaphor from sports. What I have here is the gold medal winners in high jump in Olympics. Olympics, I suppose, started in 1896, so we have about 100 plus years of data here. When you plot the 100 years of data of gold medal winners in high jump in Olympics, what you immediately find is there have been 4 non-linear business models in the high jump industry. And every time when there was a discontinuous shift in the style in high jump, the athletes were able to achieve breakout performance. And I got a picture for each one of them. Incidentally, when you really think about it, scissors is the most logical way to do high jump. Why? Suppose you're walking on the road. You find a little rod. What do? You kind of jump over it, just like the way a hurdler would jump. It's a hurdling motion. Encyclopedia Britannica found its scissors way back when. In Microsoft, we got a lot of scissors. Now, when scissors is the style in high jump, if I am an athlete, I have a job to do. What is the job? Accept the rules of scissors and become the best person in the scissors in the world. That's what I call box 1 challenge. That's operational improvement. Let's watch our costs. Let's watch our market share. Let's watch our direct competitors. Let's continue to improve the performance of scissors. Is that important? Absolutely. There is money to be made there. But what happens is, as you're trying to continuously improve the performance of scissors, there are some athletes who are experimenting with trying to change the rules of scissors. And out of those experiments, somebody succeeds and comes up with a Western roll. I got a picture of the Western roll here. In Western roll, what happens is you run up to the pole, you kick off of your right foot, you clear the bar, but then you still land on your right foot. you can visualize it, suppose you're going to kick off of your right foot and still land on your right foot. That means your back is to the pole when you clear the pole. Can you visualize that? I'm certainly not going to demonstrate that for you. Western roll was in vogue for about 25 years until someone invented the Eastern roll, or the straddle. And in straddle, what happens is you run up to the pole, you kick off of your right foot, you clear the bar, but then you land on your left foot. So if you're going to kick off of your right foot and land on your left foot, as the picture shows, your belly is to the pole when you clear the pole. And that was in vogue for about 25 years until someone invented the Fosbury flop. To no one's surprise, it was invented by Dick Fosbury in the '68 Olympics. Dick Fosbury was a gymnast, but he didn't make the U.S. gymnastic team, but he made the U.S. high jump team. As it turns out, Dick Fosbury was a very, very mediocre athlete. He wasn't a gifted athlete like a David Beckham or a Michael Jordan. But because he brought a whole new thinking to high jump, suddenly he was able to achieve breakout performance. And as the picture shows, in the flop, what you do is you run up to the pole, you launch yourself with both feet straight up in the air, very gymnastic motion. Then you twist your body 180 degrees. In fact, it is the twisting motion which allows you to elevate quite a bit high. But if you visualize, you run up to the pole, you launch yourself straight up in the air, then you're twisting your body. That means you're still straight up in the air. That means your head is the first thing that clears the bar. Then your neck, then your back. The leg clears the bar the last. In fact, he broke away from the fundamental rules of high jump, that leg has to clear the bar first. In fact, in the flop, leg clears the bar the last. You literally land on your head, so to speak. My point is this. For Microsoft, we certainly have a job to do in box one, which is to manage our current businesses for world-class performance. That's perfecting our scissors. But we have another job to do if we want to sustain leadership in the next 25 years. That is to continuously migrate ourselves, reinvent ourselves, to move from scissors to Western roll to Eastern roll to flop to something else. And what Chris and I argue, and as the encyclopedia example already pointed out, a lot of the barriers that you pointed out for Encyclopedia Britannica has nothing to do with the idea. Putting the encyclopedia on a CD-ROM is not that brilliant an idea that they couldn't have thought of. The reason they couldn't do it was all organizational barriers. And what we have been researching is how can we help organizations overcome the execution challenges in converting breakthrough ideas into breakthrough growth. The real challenge for Microsoft looking to the future is we certainly have a job to do in box one, which is competition for the present, which is about closing performance gap. Do we have performance gap in our current businesses? You bet. We are not world-class in performance yet in everything we do. We've got to close that gap. That's about restructuring. But we simultaneously have a job to do in box 2 and box 3, which is what we call competition for the future. Competition for the future is about closing opportunity gap. Between 2005 and 2020, in the next 15 years, let us say, in your industry, huge opportunities are going to be created. As Microsoft, we need to ask the question, what is the size of that opportunity that belongs to us? Incidentally, closing that opportunity gap is all about growth and innovation. And that can happen only if we use the word renewal. Renewal implies you invented the strategy once. You have to reinvent it. You have to renew it. You can never close the opportunity gap or the future by simply repeating the past. We must fundamentally reinvent our strategy. If I want to create exciting opportunities in emerging markets, that requires me to reinvent my strategy. And in this process, what we find is when you want to think about reinvention, box 2, box 3, you need to think about coming up with breakthrough ideas. Then you need to have breakthrough execution. In our research and in our work with organizations, what we find is whenever organizations want to create the future, they spend a lot of time in coming up with breakthrough ideas. They don't spend enough time on breakthrough execution. Tell me, why do organizations spend an awful lot of time in the idea generation phase, the upstream part of box 2, box 3, the front end, as it were? Where do they spend a lot of time on idea generation, but very little time on execution? Yeah?
Ideas are cheap.
Ideas are cheap, right? Other.
Cheaper to find,
Yeah.
It's more fun.
It's more fun, right? That's just that brilliant moment when you get the insight. That's more fun. And people sort of romanticize about that fun part, yeah?
They may think they can apply their existing execution on future ideas.
That's probably the biggest villain. They think execution is easy because I've already done it in the past. But what we find is execution in box 1 is very different than execution in box 2, box 3. In fact, by applying the methodologies that we have perfected in box 1, you can kill the idea. But we assume that's easy. Any other reason we spend it? Yeah?
I assume that execution often threatens existing business lines through cannibalization. It tests the organization's tolerance for risking its existing business.
Tremendously important, right? There is this tension between the existing business and this new business. And that itself makes this execution that much more difficult. And the cost structure in your core business is different than the cost structure and the profit model in the new business. Typically, your scissors, you're making a lot of money today because you've got it to a point where it is working beautifully. The margins are high, you're making a lot of cash flow. You apply the same framework and demand the same performance in the short term for box 3, it's a no-go. Huh? What we have found, and Chris is going to lead us, is how do you excel in breakthrough execution? We have studied 10 companies, 5 succeeded and 5 failed in breakthrough innovation, execution on breakthrough innovation. And studying those 10 companies, we step back and say, what are the critical challenges of execution in box 3? We know what the critical challenges of execution in box 1 is. What are the critical execution challenges in box 3? And what are some of the best practices to overcome? That's sort of our contribution in the 10 Rules book. And Chris will take us through that phase.
Maybe it'd be best if I warmed you up a little bit with a story about breakthrough execution. It was the best of times for Mammoth Corporation. Earnings were going up quarter in and quarter out. Stock price was going in one direction. Employees were happy. Customers were happy. Suppliers considered it an honor to do business with Mammoth. Then one day, Mammoth was late on a new product launch. They ceded a huge chunk of market share to a younger and hungrier competitor. At the end of the quarter, something unprecedented happened. The company missed its earnings targets. Mammoth was humbled. But the leadership team was strong and quickly rose to the challenge of restoring Mammoth's glory. The CEO gave a big speech and let every employee know that Mammoth was looking for the next big idea. The company held innovation seminars and innovation workshops and innovation retreats, all in an effort to catalyze the search. And finally, this paid off. The company got the magic it was looking for. From a dark and a forgotten corner deep within the company, there emerged a visionary, our hero, a leader with the next big idea. Now, Mammoth's senior executive team was careful. They did the research. They called on outside experts. They examined this opportunity from every conceivable angle, and in the end, they concluded that this indeed was an opportunity for a business with almost unlimited potential. And so it was that our hero got his dream job, leading Mammoth into the future. But it was not so easy as all that. Our hero soon discovered the truth about big organizations, that they are machines designed to excel at yesterday's business. Our hero ran into roadblocks, barriers, entanglements. People that demanded that he follow procedure. People that stood in the way of smart hires. People that insisted that he would fail unless he adopted more of Mammoth's best practices. Our hero awoke one night in a cold sweat. In a dream, he had been wrestled to the ground and nearly strangled to death by a giant octopus. Our hero immediately understood the significance of this dream, and he resolved right then and there that he would defeat the octopus using whatever means necessary. Mammoth would not be allowed to destroy its own future. Fortunately, our hero was tough, he was clever, and most of all, subversive. He broke rules, he worked underground, and ultimately he succeeded in defeating the system. The next big idea grew into Mammoth's biggest and most profitable business. Our hero, within a few years, was promoted to Chief Executive Officer. He was featured on the cover of Fortune magazine, revered by his peers, and a few years after that, he retired, rich and happy. So tell me, did you like the story? Anybody like the story? What did you like about it? Retiring. Okay. What else?
I think it's something that many of us in a room like the idea that we come up with something new and we won't let the old staid interests in yesterday's business sort of rain on the parade of the next big thing.
Yeah. It connects with a lot of people. As I go around and tell this story, I get that reaction a lot. You know what? I like this story too, but I like it in the same way that I like science fiction and fantasy and fairy tales. But I tell you what, the problem with this story is not just that it's fiction. Okay? The problem with this story is that it is quite literally destructive. Okay? Part of the reason that it's so destructive is that it is so powerful. People live through stories. And when it comes to innovation, no story is more powerful than the innovator versus the octopus. Okay? So what I'd like to do within the time we have remaining is help you tell a better story about innovation. Okay? Not one that's rooted in sort of motivational mythology, okay? But one that's rooted in rigorous science. One that's based in the 10 rules that our research has helped uncover. All right? And most of all, one that will help overcome the two key flaws in this story. First of all, too much emphasis on the next big idea. As Vijay was talking about just before, breakthrough performance is every bit as much about breakthrough ideas as it is about breakthrough execution. This story was all about the idea. Okay? We need a story that's both about the idea and about execution. Rule number 1 of our 10 rules is this. In any great innovation story, the idea is only chapter 1. Okay? The second problem with this story was that there was far too much emphasis on individual achievement. Okay? I submit to you that no leader, no matter how talented, is going to overcome the octopus alone. Okay? Breakthrough execution is much more about organizational excellence. That's the focus of the other 9 rules. Now, to stimulate your imagination a little bit more about what a good story about breakthrough innovation might be like, I'd like to share one of the stories from our research. This is a story of New York Times Digital, the internet business unit of the New York Times Company. Okay. By the way, we did lots of stories in our research from lots of different industries. Nanotechnology, biotechnology, product companies launching services businesses, and so forth. I really like to share this story when I have only a short amount of time because it's so familiar. Okay? It takes me no time at all to explain what these businesses are because everybody's read the newspaper and everybody at least once or twice has scanned the web for news. Okay? So you know what these businesses are all about. Now, if you'd had the chance to visit the New York Times Company back in the mid-1990s, you would have found a company that was feeling very, very good about itself. It was in the midst of a very successful national expansion. Okay? Its influence was strong, its readers were elite, and its history was rich. In fact, if you visit the headquarters of the New York Times newspaper, you'll see posters like this, celebrating important headlines way back in history, like this one from D-Day. Journalists all over the country tend to view a paper like the New York Times as a career destination. In fact, if you've been a journalist at the New York Times Company for less than 10 years, you're sort of viewed as a newcomer. Okay? Well, in 1995, tradition crossed paths with technology. Turns out an employee in the IT department at the New York Times Company had a chance to have a conversation with the CEO. And he said, you know, boss, I think this internet thing might be kind of big. Maybe we ought to do something about it. And to his credit, the CEO agreed. And a transformational journey began. Now, as a first step, I'd like to acknowledge that at first glance, this does not look like a radical transformation. Okay? There are a lot of very obvious similarities between the New York Times newspaper and the New York Times on the web. But if you think about the underlying business model, it is, of course, very, very different. We're talking about a routine daily news cycle on the one hand versus continuous news on the other. We're talking about striving always to charge a premium price versus free. We're talking about a business based on journalism expertise versus a business rooted in software excellence. Okay? We're talking about, from an advertiser's perspective, a business that represents an opportunity for broad-based brand building versus one that represents an opportunity for precise targeting of customers. And from the reader's perspective, the one that probably most of you and I am most familiar with, on the one hand, you've got text and still pictures. On the other hand, you've got the full range of multimedia content, not just from the New York Times newspaper, but from a wide variety of other sources as well. Okay? Breakthrough innovation is about such radical shifts in business model, like what happened here with the New York Times Company. Now, the first thing that the New York Times Company did when they decided to build this business was they launched a serious, committed external search for somebody to lead the business. Okay? They hired Martin Nisenholtz, a man who had spent his entire career developing expertise in interactive communications. They immediately put Martin in a pretty senior position. On day one, he was reporting to the general manager and editor of the newspaper. He also got a great, experienced New York Times staff. Okay? Now, as a result of this setup, this business got off to a very fast start. It got off to a fast start because it had easy access to the wealth of resources within the newspaper. But by 1997, there were some concerns starting to elevate. Concerns that this business was not evolving as quickly as the world of online media around it. In fact, by 1997, some of the people working on New York Times on the web were referring to their business, somewhat sarcastically, as newspaper.com. They even called the software that they had developed shovelware, as in all it could do is take the newspaper and shovel it online. Now, as you can imagine, Martin Nisenholtz was very ambitious. Okay? And this conservative approach really started to frustrate him. He felt he was constantly running up against constraints, not just in resources, but in mindsets, in assumptions about what it would take to succeed in this new world. Okay? By 1998, other people were starting to get concerned, namely Wall Street analysts, who began to really pressure the company and say, gee, are you really investing enough in this new world called the internet? Okay? Well, eventually the CEO agreed with that as well and decided to make some radical changes to the way New York Times Digital was organized. He decided the New York Times Digital needed to be a separate organization. Okay? Separate's very easy to say. It's a little bit harder to say exactly what that means. So let me tell you exactly what they did. First of all, they gave Martin a promotion. Okay? No longer did he report to the general manager and editor of the newspaper. He reported directly to the president of the corporation. In addition, the company started hiring so heavily from the outside that by 2000, 75% of the employees at New York Times Digital had come from outside sources. Okay? Think about these two changes in the context of a company where if you'd been there less than a decade, you were considered a newcomer. Okay? These may sound like less significant changes than they really were. And it's not all they did. Okay? New York Times Digital also completely broke down their product development process and rebuilt it, breaking many of the traditional organizational rules that exist inside newspapers. Okay? They reinvented their planning process so that it made more sense in a fast-paced and uncertain environment. And they even created something called a culture committee to explicitly identify the core values inside the newspaper and decide what applied to this new business and what did not. All of these significant organizational changes had a very positive impact. Okay? All kinds of new features and business experiments started showing up on the website. And in fact, there was an explosion in revenue growth. Okay? This business exceeded its targets almost every quarter until the bubble started to explode. Okay? But not all was well. This new setup created new problems. There started to develop a lot of tensions between the two business units. Okay? I think you can imagine about what a lot of these tensions were all about. All of a sudden, you've got this new business operating very independently and breaking all of the rules in some ways. And yet it still wants to leverage some of those key assets inside the newspaper, like its brand, like its content. Okay? So tensions developed over control of the brand, access to key customer relationships, okay? Competition for resources, even simple jealousy. And so although New York Times Digital really increased its revenue growth, its efficiency and its profitability suffered as a result of these tensions. In 2001, when the bubble really started to deflate, New York Times Digital found itself in a very serious bind. Top line was up, but this is a company that was still losing a great deal of money. The powers that be within the newspaper almost succeeded at folding this business back into the newspaper and reducing it once again to a newspaper.com operation. But the CEO once again prevailed and directed Martin to get to profitability as quickly as possible, and more importantly, created a senior management team that was dedicated to nothing other than making sure these links between the two organizations were healthy and productive. And that worked. New York Times Digital achieved profitability in the last quarter of 2001 and have done nothing but grow in profitability since then. It's a lot of a story, so let me summarize quickly what's here. This is a three-stage story. There was a period of very cautious growth in the beginning, where the only major organizational change they made to the way they normally do business is they hired an outside leader. Okay? They then had a very aggressive period of rapid growth, where the organization changed much more dramatically. Not just an outside leader, but all the other things I talked about as well. Finally, in their drive to profitability, they really focused on making sure just a couple of crucial links between the two businesses were as effective as possible. Okay? Now, this story is far from over. Okay? They're still reevaluating both strategy and organizational design every year because, as you know, the world of online media is still evolving very, very quickly. But I think there's quite a lot that can be drawn from the story so far. Let me ask you, what sticks out in your mind as some of the key things that may be key success factors for growing new businesses within established organizations? Why did this story have a happy ending? Yes?
Executive understanding and commitment to making big changes.
Okay, executive commitment from the top to making big organizational changes. Yep? Other thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
They were willing to not impose on the new business situation those things that fed the standing business situations. So processes and checks and balances and whatever that went into maintaining a good newspaper.
In fact, one of the really critical things that they did was to release New York Times Digital from the support functions that existed within the company. This is a story that in stage 2, this is a business unit that created its own separate policy team. Okay, separate heads of human resources, IT, finance, strategy, and so forth. Yes?
Well, I'm just thinking about this as distinct from the group that created the CD with Encyclopedia Britannica. I highly doubt that they had their own division. There was not the consciousness that this was a brave new world. It was just a little accessory.
Yes.
And then it was just a matter of, well, how do we price without cannibalizing?
So one thing we're seeing is that with breakthrough ideas entering a whole new world, you have to make pretty dramatic changes on the organizational side as well. Yes?
It seems like they were effective in playing what were historically valuable assets into a new context. They They brought some still forward with them.
Yes.
But in an effective way.
They didn't break away from everything. They did hold on to a couple of really crucial assets. Further thoughts? Yes.
They didn't let the mistakes turn into failures. They made mistakes, learned from it, and adapted, and then cycled.
Yeah, they were willing at several crucial points to completely reevaluate what they were doing. Good. Oh yeah, thank you. Over here.
I'm wondering if there's some selection bias going on here. It turns out that the old traditional newspaper business, if you stuck by your guns in that period of time, you would have made a mistake. And doing anything other than that was a good move. But in most businesses, that's probably not true. That is, sticking by what works is probably going to work out better than on the radical idea. And so if we were to look at any other, I mean, the thing is that all the newspapers right now are suffering, so the story sounds good, right? But if you picked any other business where there was some radical ideas and some guys who stuck by their guns, the guys who stuck by their guns on balance might have done better.
That's very true. So one thing that we did not do is try and take a wide sample and discover, when starting a new business was a better idea than not doing it. What we look for is what are the...
Anybody who bet on the old newspaper business over that period of time probably made a bad bet.
Indeed. What we looked at specifically in our research, however, is what organizational choices tend to lead to success in a few crucial areas, which I'll describe now.
But if you select for successes, you've got a selection bias.
I see what you're saying. Other thoughts?
So you didn't really talk about the tracking stock a whole lot. It seems to me, though, that they came as close to a whole new company as they could while still being part of the New York Times.
Yes, indeed.
And I guess, in my mind, I contrast this experience with that of General Motors and Saturn Corporation. They tried to create a whole new thing, but then reeled it back in.
There has to be a very delicate balance between creating something new and still holding on to some key assets that really are beneficial to the new company. It turns out that the tracking stock, does everybody know what a tracking stock is? It is a special security that follows the performance of just one business unit as opposed to the company as a whole. A lot of the reason that they made these changes was to support a tracking stock launch. Those organizational changes turned out to be the right answer anyway. Okay? And in fact, the tracking stock was never launched. So. Yes?
I can't help but to notice that this kind of looks like raising a child. I mean,
very interesting.
The first part, you're in utero almost, right? And then the child is born, and then you keep them close, you raise them, you train them, and then they go off, and every once in a while you have to reel them back in and show them the right things.
Very interesting.
I just thought.
About the time they're 40, they start.
Great discussion. I want to be sure that we use the remaining time to wrap up with some key principles for managing new businesses that are derived from our work. So we're going to transition from innovation stories to some of the key concepts that we've developed. And of course, a great place to start is this simple two-stage model of the innovation process, a front end and a back end. In our view, companies way overspend their time in the front end, where the real execution challenges are in the back end. And we find in our research that there are three fundamental challenges that companies face in the back end of the innovation process. Okay? Those three fundamental challenges are a forgetting challenge, a borrowing challenge, and a learning challenge. Okay? Forgetting challenge is in the new company, which I'm just going to call NewCo, must forget the core company or CoreCo's success formula. Okay? NewCo must forget CoreCo's success formula. Okay? Borrow. NewCo must borrow CoreCo's assets. Okay? And learn. NewCo must learn how to succeed in a new and uncertain market. Okay? Forget, borrow, and learn. Now, before going any further, I want to make a crucial distinction between forgetting and learning on one hand and borrowing on the other. Okay? Forgetting and learning go on up here. Forgetting and learning are about mindsets, biases, assumptions, and so forth. Borrowing is entirely different. Okay? Borrowing is about assets that have real value. Okay? Things like the New York Times brand, or more generally, manufacturing capacity, or customer relationships, or expertise in certain technical areas. Okay? Those are the things that you borrow. Now that you know what the three challenges are, forget, borrow, and learn, I want to introduce you to two laws. Law number one is that forget and borrow are always in tension. There's a very tricky balance here. Okay? If you're completely focused on forgetting, you create a completely separate company with no interactions with the core company. Okay? Without interactions, there's no ability to borrow. Okay? If you focus on borrowing, okay, it's very hard to forget. So there's always tension between the two. The second law is that forgetting is a prerequisite to learning. Okay? If the new company remains concretely adhered to the old company's assumptions, okay, it's never going to discover a new success formula. Okay? So we never saw a case where a company succeeded at failed to forget, but then succeeded in learning. One is a prerequisite for the other. Okay? All right, now, you may not have ever thought about it this way, but I'll bet all of you have been through an experience where you've forgotten, borrowed, and learned. Let me give you an example. If you went off to college, you probably forgot your parents' rules, borrowed their laundry facilities, okay, and learned how to succeed on your own terms. All right? Forget, borrow, and learn. So everybody's done this at some point. Notice even in that very simple example, the two laws hold. Okay? If you tried to borrow too much, say by living at home to save rent, borrowing dad's car all the time, and so forth, probably had a very hard time escaping some of their rules. Okay? Also, if you had a hard time escaping those rules, you probably had a hard time defining a new pattern of success that worked for you. Okay? So the two laws still hold. Okay, forget, borrow, and learn. Now, I want you to notice one thing about the New York Times digital story, hitting on the theme that there's always tension between forgetting and borrowing. Okay. They started up here, where they had a very good ability to borrow, but had a real struggle in forgetting. Okay. They then made those dramatic organizational changes where New York Times Digital was pretty isolated. Okay. And that they were able to forget, but they had all this tension that prevented them from borrowing effectively. Okay. Finally, they evolved to what we call a distinct but linked organization. That's slightly more specific than just a separate organization. Distinct but linked means, okay, the new company is distinct from Corco. It's like turning all the organizational rules on their head. Okay? But it's not isolated. It's linked in some very carefully selected and very carefully managed ways. That's what enables the company to borrow. All right, so to wrap up, I'd like to give you 3 common mistakes that companies make in forgetting, borrowing, and learning. Okay. First of all, forgetting. It's very common for companies to hire almost entirely from within. Okay. Almost always, building a breakthrough new business involves building a new competence, and that requires outside support. As one company in our sample, Corning, learned, it's not only important to hire outsiders, it's important to put them in influential positions. It was crucial that the New York Times Company put Martin Nisenholtz at the top of NewCo. Okay? The second common mistake is to have NewCo report to Corco. Anytime that's the case, Corco has too much influence, and it becomes very hard to escape assumptions about success. Okay? It is very important in the New York Times story that Martin Nisenholtz got that promotion and was promoted and reported to the president of the corporation. Finally, it's a very common mistake that NewCo will measure its performance based on the same measures and standards that Corco does. Okay. One company in our sample, Analog Devices, created a new semiconductor product that launches airbags in cars. Okay. It's a great story. For a long time, they were having some misperceptions and made some missteps because they measured this business's performance based on gross margin. And the standards for gross margin in the core business were much different because the cost structure was much different. Okay? Borrowing. Most common mistake is to try and borrow too much. Okay? Each time you borrow, you create more interaction with the core business, okay? And you give the core business more influence. Borrow too much, it becomes impossible to forget. It's crucial to identify 1 or 2 assets that the core business has that truly lend crucial competitive advantage to the new business. Borrow those 2 things and nothing else. Everything else you build from scratch. especially support functions. Okay? Second common mistake is to leave very, very powerful incentives in place within Corco to hit the short-term numbers. Okay? This is okay for many managers, but it's not okay for the managers that are trying to help the new business. Okay? They're not okay for the managers that are interacting, okay, with NewCo so that NewCo can borrow. Okay? When Corco only cares about its own immediate future, it's not going to care about NewCo. That seems fairly intuitive. Finally, very common mistake is to neglect tensions between NewCo and Corco. Anytime there's interaction between NewCo and Corco, there's tension. It is a difficult management challenge. Okay? In many cases, we see the senior management team very, very involved at the very beginning of launching a new venture, and then not so involved in the execution phase. Okay? There is a crucial role for the senior management team, and that is watching those links, selecting the right ones, and making sure they are cooperative and productive. Okay? Now, we haven't talked much about learning yet. Let me give a brief definition for learning. Okay? You can think of learning as a pretty broad topic, but we have a very specific learning objective in mind. And that's this. NewCo has to learn how to predict its own future. Okay? Now, as you all know, when you write a business plan for a new business, it's full of wild guesses. Okay? That's inevitable. Okay? There's only so much you can know. The key for NewCo is to get from wild guess to informed estimate to reliable forecast as quickly as possible. Okay? Now, predictions are at the heart of the planning process. So every recommendation we have to support learning has to do with changing the way you plan. Okay? I'll give you 3 common mistakes. One is to apply the same standards of accountability to plan that you apply in Corco to NewCo. Okay? NewCo is tremendously uncertain. When you hold managers accountable within NewCo to hitting the numbers, they can't learn. Why? Because they can't revise their plan. They've got to hit the number. The number is sacrosanct. Okay? If you're going to learn, you have to have a process for revising those plans. And you have to revise them quickly. A second common mistake is to gather a bunch of general managers, including Corco-type general managers and NewCo-type general managers, in the same room at the same time to review performance. Okay? The standards of evaluation are so different that this never works. Inevitably, NewCo ends up evaluating its performance along Corco's standards. Final common mistake is to stay on the annual planning cycle. Okay? The rate at which you learn is directly tied to the rate at which you revise your plans. Okay? New businesses need to revise quarterly or even monthly, depending on how fast-paced their business is. That's a lot of work. So it also follows that you better make your plans pretty simple and to the point. No more breakdowns by channel, by geography, by product line. Okay? Just identify a few of the most critical unknowns and plan on resolving them as quickly as you can. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Yes?
Thinking about the New York Times example, it seems that a lot of this ultimately resolves down to a basic decision about how much separation is going to be.
Yes, that was a crucial component.
A lot of these things are essentially dimensions of separation between the new